For more on this story, we are now joined live in the studio by political analyst at the Wits University School of Governance, Professor Suzanne Boysen. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. Now, what's your view on the ruling of the Court today?
Now, I have the impression that legally it was quite straightforward, quite a simple issue to discuss, and it was a unanimous ruling by all these esteemed Constitutional Court judges. But a number of very interesting nuances came out there, reminders, especially from the Chief Justice Mogoeng, that this is a constitutional democracy, and in effect he was giving politicians, high-level politicians at the highest level in South Africa, a good lesson in democracy and what it means to be a constitutional democracy. There were many reminders of what it really means.
Now, just looking, some of the political parties have called this decision a victory for democracy. Would you call that, just mentioning that?
I really think it was very important for democracy, and I would think, and I know from doing research interviews, that it's not just opposition parties who say that, but many ANC people are equally relieved about that. It is really the importance of South Africa being a constitutional democracy, and in South Africa there's so often a conflict between being a dominant party, majoritarian democracy, and a constitutional democracy. Very often these two are synchronized. In good times, it doesn't really matter either way. But as it also emerged in this judgment, there's a recognition of toxic and politically hazardous times. And that is times where we are now, where that contrast between majoritarianism, where the ruling party, majoritarian party, of course, like the President Zuma said just now, reminded the people, majoritarian party, they still rule and they have so many MPs, but there are so many tensions and factions in there, and it's not always quite certain who is in control or who should rather be in control.
Now, just with today's judgment which was delivered by the Chief Justice earlier today, do you think this will make the Speaker, or sort of direct the Speaker to give in to what the opposition is requesting, or are we likely to see another, well, non-issue, so to speak?
That's a very interesting point, because I think Chief Justice Mogoeng really edged her into directing her what would be the constitutionally appropriate way to act. And there was no doubt that it was deemed constitutionally more appropriate, also in terms of interest for democracy and for the people as the primary constituencies, not the political parties. She was clearly edged in that direction. And maybe her decision is also on the cards, given that her counsel in earlier argument to the Constitutional Court had actually conceded that she is not so averse to it. So they said, it's just that she didn't realize whether she didn't think she had the powers. So all indications are that she's being pushed in that direction. Interesting, we've heard ANC Chief Whip Jackson Tembu indicating just now that the ANC would not be obstructionist if the Rules Committee come to them, indicating that yes, they would endorse a secret ballot. But on the other end of the spectrum, we've just heard the President repeating his statement, open vote the way it has always been done. So I think the Speaker is really going to show her implicit, no longer to be implicit political colours when she takes that decision.
Now, just going back to the President's reaction and saying that this is the 8th time, and most likely there'll be more no confidence motions against him. Is he sort of giving us an indication of the direction that she may take as the National Speaker, as Baleka Mbete, as the President during the Q&A, sort of given an indication, or, you know, implied basically that it's the 8th one and there might be more to come?
Yes, it could be. He certainly seems to, but that is the President's style. You know, it is never a crisis that's just a little challenge, and mostly in his world, an opposition-instigated crisis, but or challenge. But we know by now it is really more than that. We know the factionalism within the ANC, and we know there are ANC MPs who are seriously inclined to vote against the president. I think the big hurdle for them is that voting against the president might be construed as voting with or for the opposition. But that is one of those internal processes that is currently unfolding. For the hearts and the minds of those MPs who may be dissenting.
Now, do you see the Speaker settling for a secret ballot?
I tend to think she will be going that direction. But then on the other hand, she could do a public protector act, like Advocate Mkhwebane, whom we've seen earlier this week, had taken a pretty controversial, seemingly controversial, direction. And she, even in interviews with her, has deferred it to the courts. And where people say, but have you got the right to say the Constitutional Court, the Constitution must be revised? She deferred to the courts, which seems to indicate she is not altogether too sure of her case. She didn't try to defend those positions. And I mention this because nothing would prevent the Speaker to take an equally controversial direction in what she decides, just knowing that it will go to the courts. There is no doubt if that goes to the courts, if one reads the Chief Justice correctly today, no doubt that he would rule in favor of, yes, it has to be a secret ballot if it gets to the Constitutional Court, but in that way, she might she might decide to play for time, and that would be a perfect way to create a perfect storm.
Prof, would she be within her constitutional right if she decides not to allow a secret vote?
You know, that is it's so nuanced, it's so tricky. Whereas the Chief Justice today, by all indications, seemed to suggest, yes, in these toxic and politically hazardous times, he emphasized the context so much. And we know what the context is at the moment. And he suggested that in those contexts, a secret ballot would be fine without doing judicial overreach and prescribing what to do. But he simultaneously, I think, left a small opening to her that she could come up with some reasonable argument. That question of reasonableness is a very big judicial criterion. If it's reasonable, and political parties, how they are configured, and she does have a small opening to construct a reasonable argument in that space. But I think overall the odds are stacked against going for a typical party political vote.
Now, Prof, in the President's reaction, he has said that the DA would not get the majority it wants by coaxing ANC MPs to vote with them, which means voting against him. Now, do you foresee, you touched on the issue of the fact that there might be a possibility where ANC MPs would prefer to vote in a secret ballot, but because of political issues, it might not be good for the party, and they might think the party first instead of individuals first. Now, in terms of that, do you think the ANC MPs would support a motion of no confidence given a secret ballot?
You know, there is so much turmoil inside there, and we know there is so much tag calling. People are being identified, saying, yes, you are, and they are being called traitors within the ANC. There is much campaigning against the group of people, and it is reasonably substantial, a few dozen, the exact number, not even they know. But there are really so much turmoil in there, and there's continuous head counting in there, because we know, because the ANC has 249 out of 400 MPs, they would need a minimum of 50 people from the ANC to switch, and with some of the opposition parties, smaller ones, not entirely committed to voting with the other opposition parties. Here we can think of the National Freedom Party, although they might vote with an opposition lines. The African Independent Congress, given their gambles in the Eastern Cape as to which province, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, they have some leverage there. So probably there is required about 70 or so ANC MPs to switch. And it seems unlikely by previous indications, but then we must also know the times are changing. The political guard is changing. More and more people in the ANC know that their future is probably not with that grouping, but with that grouping. And as we also get closer to the ANC's year-end elective conference, more and more people are likely to be inclined to go and show, to change colours if they judge that another faction, for example, that specific faction opposing the Zuma's camp, has got a better chance of succeeding, that the climate is changing sufficiently, that might bring them to change in due course, more than what had been the case in the past.
Now, Prof, the ANC in Parliament, they've welcomed the ruling, but say it doesn't really change its stance. Now, it has cited examples in the Western Cape Provincial Legislature where the DA refused to vote with the ANC to remove Western Cape Premier Helen Zille. Now, are there any parallels between the two votes? Do you think, there's similarities and so on?
Yes, of course there are parallels. It's political partyism and political parties refusing to vote against their leaders, no matter how big the sin or the evidence against that person for corruption or for promoting colonialism, defending it, how big that case may be. When push comes to shove, those party members are still very, very reluctant to show support for an opposition party's tack, especially if that is the DA. However, if one, for example, gets to a situation where the vote of no confidence, motion of no confidence, could be projected as a more non-party political initiative, perhaps driven by the UDM, then perhaps, we don't know, but there's a possibility that more people might be inclined to go along with it.
Now, let's just speak hypothetically. Say the national speaker agrees to a secret ballot vote, and we see something unprecedented where we see a party voting, the ANC voting with the opposition. Just what do you think would happen there?
Now, if the vote against the president works, a motion of no confidence, of course, that's in terms of the constitution, then the cabinet and the deputy ministers and the deputy president, the whole government there has to resign. But that does not mean that an opposition party will be entering parliament. The ANC, which then would have shown colours and would have a certain majority, they could be voting in. There could be a massive instant realignment within the ANC, and many more semi-crossing the floor to the new dominant faction in ANC, and they could simply put a new ANC government, ANC president, deputy president in place. Or there could be, unlikely I would say, but there could be some alliance with some of the opposition parties. But I don't think so. I think rather there would be a very rapid realignment in the ANC, like we also saw in a time when Thabo Mbeki was ousted, and there could be another ANC caretaker government until the next election.
Now, Prof, let's look at the issue in Mogale City, where recently the DA instructed its councillors to basically take lie detector tests after some of the their members voted in favour of removing the mayor. Now, yet they support this ruling. Explain that. How does it work?
That is politics. Two minds. Changing a mind, two minds, any configuration is possible there. It is quite ludicrous. I would love to see that one ending up in Justice Mogoeng's inbox to see what he says about that.
Now, do you think that Chief Justice Mogoeng, in delivering his judgment today, and throwing it back to the National Speaker of Parliament to say this actually falls in your house. Yes. You are the decision maker there. Is it sort of an indication to say that maybe political parties must stop using the courts as rushing to the courts in terms of decision making? Is there any underlying, message there, or is it just as it is that the National Speaker is a final decision maker and she must take ownership of that position?
I really think it is the latter. It is her job to do that. And I actually got the impression that he quite enjoyed giving this political lecture to the politicians as to how to behave, how to do their work better, and reminding them in terms of the Constitution that they need to represent citizens of South Africa, the people of South Africa in the first place. But I think he didn't mind giving that little lesson and imparting that wisdom and the more impartial perspective, a person of wisdom who is not caught up in the fracas between the factions of a political party and between the political parties. I really think it is very useful and very valuable judgment that will really strengthen South Africa's democracy.
Now, looking at the legal costs that now President Zuma and the National Speaker Balekambete have to pay.
Yes, I would have preferred to see that being awarded with personal costs to them, because as it is awarded, those costs will be paid by the taxpayer as it stands. And we have seen on social media already a big outburst about that. It's really felt that people felt, yes, they have been represented. The Chief Justice has defended their interest in there, but who is paying? And quite a few senior counsel were involved in that case. I can imagine it cost a good pretty penny.
Now, Prof, before we wrap up, in terms of timeframes, when do you think we're likely to see decision making coming from the National Speaker with regards to the motion of vote of no confidence, whether it'll be in a secret ballot or not? In terms of timeframes, any ideas there?
And I do think first, Parliament is going into mid-year recess now for roughly a month or so, and it is basically a week left. I doubt whether anything will happen in the next week, but it could also be fast-tracked, but I think it will be unlikely, and it has to go to Parliamentary Rules Committee, and there will be a decision there, and then the Speaker will probably in that sequence then schedule this debate. So given that, we're probably looking at early August by current calculations.
Prof, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that was political analyst Professor Suzanne Boysen joining us in studio. Time now for a quick break. More news when we return. Stay with us.